on this episode of Big Giant Heads.
Where one of the posters used to be, there was a woman, and she was wearing nothing but very small underwear. There was so much to see and so much I didn't understand about what I was seeing.
They're discovering porn way younger than we think, probably in grade school. It's super important to talk about the difference between toxic porn and also people having consent for what's going on in the scenes.
Today, we're excited to share a chat we had with Goddess Soma, whose experience as a dominatrix among many other creative roles made her a perfect fit for the topic of this episode.
But to get us started, we have a story where a young boy navigates his way between childhood and being a bachelor.
Take it away.
Do you remember your grandparents' basement? Maybe you'd play hide and seek around dusty antiques or stacked cardboard boxes. Or maybe you'd be asked to find something in the darkest corner lit by that single hanging light bulb. That was the opposite of my grandparents' basement. Down there, the furniture was fresh from IKEA. The walls had cool posters and everything was lit by moody lamps or colorful neon signage. There were 3 rooms, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a bedroom. In the bedroom, there was a TV and a waterbed. Everything you could need. In this 7-year-old's opinion, it was the coolest place you could ever live. This was my uncle's bachelor pad. Being the youngest of 4, my Uncle Rich was the closest adult to being my age. This meant he was the most knowledgeable about all the things I should know next in life. I knew this because he had Nintendo and tons of movies and CDs. His status in my family as a bachelor was interesting to me because my family also referred to my dad as a bachelor. But being a single dad didn't seem to have as many perks as being a single uncle. For one, we didn't have Nintendo, or any neon wall signs. But I knew that your cool decor wasn't what made you a bachelor. A bachelor was someone who was looking for a girlfriend to bring home to show off their amazing bedroom. So, whenever we'd visit my grandparents, that's usually what Rich would be doing, getting ready to go out to bring someone back to his bedroom. But when he left, he always let me hang out to play Nintendo. And normally, this would be the only thing I would do. But tonight there was something new on the wall. Where one of the posters used to be, there was a calendar. It was January, but that's not why I noticed it. There was a woman, and she was wearing nothing but very small underwear. And she had this expression, an allure, that was begging me to look closer. So I did. I just stood there staring. There was so much to see and so much I didn't understand about what I was seeing. Why was this woman naked? Why did my uncle have this as his calendar? Is this a bachelor's calendar? These questions kept me frozen in place. I stood there for so long, my eyes went dry from not blinking. Then, suddenly I became intensely aware of my surroundings. I wasn't making a sound. Surely someone would notice how quiet I was being. And for some reason, I didn't want anyone to know what I was doing. But I needed to keep looking. I put a game in the Nintendo, turned on the TV, and tapped the TV video button on the remote. The familiar sounds played as the game started. Now I could take a minute to catch my breath while I listened for any movement upstairs. The only other time I'd seen anything like this calendar was when I was taken into the women's changing room at the community center pool. Like many times before, I didn't dry my hair enough on my own. So when I met my mom outside the changing rooms, she noticed right away.
You can't go outside like that. You'll freeze to death. Come with me.
Suddenly, I was following her through the steamy entrance to the women's changing room. Everything was exactly like the men's, except flipped. Left was right, right was left, and the air was sweeter and less musky. I had never really felt comfortable in the men's changing room by myself, and being with my mom in the women's didn't help that feeling. So I tried to keep my head down, but my mom was directing my movements towards a counter with a blow dryer. I was facing a wall of bare skin. I tried looking in any other direction, but there was no escaping the nakedness. And as we approached the counter, I was sure the naked bodies would be disturbed by a clothed, wet-headed boy poking his head between them. But they weren't. They were more accommodating of my flustered mom to be concerned about me. So, this made me feel like it was okay to look around a little more freely. But I still had a tingly feeling. Though I looked small for my age, I felt like I might be a little too old to be in the women's changing room. The same way I was probably a little too young to be looking at this sexy calendar in my uncle's bedroom. Not that the pictures were bad, just that I was probably a little too young to be seeing them. But I couldn't get into trouble just for seeing something, right? So, after exploring all 12 ladies of the year, I tried to actually play Nintendo. But my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't help but feel like I had gotten away with something, even though I couldn't quite process it. For months after, whenever we'd visit my grandparents, I'd follow the same ritual before playing Nintendo. I'd look at the calendar for long enough to keep an image of each month in my mind until the next time we'd visit. You could say it was the only thing on my mind when I wasn't at my grandparents'. That is until something much more powerful grabbed my attention. An obsession bigger than Nintendo or naked women. Something I could actually talk about and share with the world. Batman. In 1989, Batman came out in theaters. It was huge, and everyone was talking about it. I had watched every episode of the original Batman TV series. It was in reruns after school. But I could never get enough. So when this movie came out, it became the center of my world, and I forgot about everything else. School, Nintendo, naked ladies. And throughout the year, I made my room a shrine to Batman. I had Batman bed sheets, the Batmobile, the utility belt, and a bat symbol neon wall light. My dad even made me a Batman Halloween costume, one of a kind. I listened to the soundtrack on my Walkman, and I had watched our VHS tapes so much that at some parts it was just static. But it didn't matter. I had memorized every scene by heart. And yet, I was still discovering new things that made me love Batman even more. Like, Bruce Wayne was also a bachelor. Batman was the best. And I continued to collect as much Bat stuff as I could. Birthdays and holidays came and went, but my obsession remained. So when Valentine's Day approached and my teacher handed out a class list for us all to make Valentine's Day cards for each other, I could think of no better theme. In the car on the way home that day, I told my dad about the class Valentine's project. So when we stopped for groceries, he let me go look for cards in the Valentine's-themed stationery aisle. At first glance, there weren't any Batman or any comic-themed character cards. But I methodically scanned each row of cards just in case. When my dad came back, I still hadn't found what I was looking for and was just about to settle on a generic, bright red and pink design. But then my dad pointed to a discounted items bin. I didn't expect much, but to my surprise, in the carelessly dumped pile of stationery supplies were comic character cards, packs of 32 Batman and Friends Valentine's cards. I couldn't believe it. Each pack had cards featuring Batman or one of the other characters, and they were all discounted. How was the supply of Batman-themed Valentine's cards outpacing the demand? It looked like I'd be the only kid giving out these amazing cards. When I got home, I went straight to my bedroom/Batman shrine. I closed my door and put on the Batman soundtrack. Then I pulled out the class list and unwrapped the pack of cards. They were already pretty amazing. They had messages and word bubbles like, "Let's fight crime together," and "Be my sidekick." But still, they needed something more. They needed something special from me too. But I drew a blank. I suddenly realized that I didn't quite understand the assignment. Was I supposed to make cards for everyone, or just the girls? For that matter, what was Valentine's Day all about? I went to ask my dad. He explained that Valentine's Day was about love and that you give a Valentine's card to someone who you'd like to be your girlfriend. but we were all a little too young for that. And besides, we were probably supposed to make cards for everyone, so nobody would feel left out. Well, it had been a year since my encounter with the calendar. And I didn't know about the rest of the class, but I had been working on making my room the coolest place since the Batcave. And at Christmas, I'd noticed that the calendar was gone from my uncle's bedroom. Cool Uncle Rich had moved on. It seemed we were all a little older. I wasn't sure if I was, in fact, old enough, but one thing I did know in that moment was that I didn't have a girlfriend. Like my dad, my uncle, and Batman, I was a bachelor too. My bedroom Batman shrine wasn't as cool as the Batcave, or even my uncle's bachelor pad, but it was decorated to impress. So in my eyes, I had the bedroom, and I had the maturity. And I needed to express all of this with my Valentine's cards. I pulled out my pencil crayons and got to work. For the girls, I drew something I'd practiced drawing all year. I drew the bat symbol, but I only colored a few with the iconic yellow and black, because I needed time for the rest of the class. For the boys, I drew something I hadn't drawn before. For the fellow bachelors, I drew breasts. Not naked women, just disembodied breasts, colored with 2 shades of pink. I drew big ones, I drew small ones. Some I just used as the O's when writing the word boobies. I had to be a little more creative because I couldn't draw breast as well as I could draw the bat symbol. But when I was finished, I was happy with each and every one of them. And I proudly signed my name David F. to make sure I wasn't confused with the other David in the class. I wanted recognition for my art. On the way to school the next day, I didn't show my dad or tell anyone about the cards. I wanted them to be a complete surprise. I was sure the class would be blown away by the action-packed Batman theme and hand-drawn art pieces. And when my teacher would see them, she'd show all the other teachers what David F. created in her class. Then the principal would catch wind of the excitement and he'd call my dad to praise the father of the kid who set a new standard for Valentine's cards. This is what I was thinking as I carefully dropped each card into one of the unique cardboard mailboxes we had made the previous week. But after the last one, I felt that tingly feeling again. It hadn't occurred to me that some of the boys in my class might be too young to be seeing breasts, even if they were just hand-drawn. But, like me, surely no one would get in trouble for seeing such a thing. But could I get in trouble for drawing them? Nah. Everyone would be too amazed by how much effort I put into each card. At the end of the day, we all took our Valentine's mailboxes home. I was excited to see how many cards I received, but more so if anyone else had made custom cards like me. I emptied the tissue box I had crafted to look like the Batmobile onto the floor of my room. It looked like everyone had made cards for everyone else. Most had nice handwritten signatures accompanying a typical Valentine's greeting. And there were a few specially written just for me. But there wasn't a single drawing or unique theme. Was I the only one that had made something truly from the heart? Oh well, at least people will remember my cards. The next day, I came to class with even more confidence than I did the day before. Oh, David, your cards were the best of all the cards, and I love my hand-drawn bat symbol. The girls would compare cards to see who had the absolute best. I didn't expect the guys to show off their breast cards, but I thought at least they'd mention something to me. Where did you learn to draw those? Then I'd tell them about the calendar with the women wearing small underwear. But the day came and went without anyone saying anything. Not the girls and not the guys. Only lots of talk about a few budding classroom romances. Jason is Catherine's girlfriend now. Sheena was kissing Mike behind the gym. But I couldn't care less. No one said a thing about my cards. In fact, no one said more than a few words to me all day. But little did I know, people were talking about my cards. A lot of parents. And those parents had called the school. And the principal had called my dad after all. That evening, I was playing with my Legos, trying to forget about the card fiasco. At the opposite end of the room, my dad was lying on the couch with his eyes closed. It wasn't a normal scene. Usually he'd be making dinner or playing piano or watching TV. Not tonight. In the silence of our living room, even I could feel the weight of something on his mind. So when he suddenly spoke, it startled me. "David?"
Yeah?
The question he asked next always stuck with me for how much it implied about the conversation he must have had with the school. And as I processed the words, I had a tingly feeling it had to do with my cards. My dad spoke softly and without opening his eyes. "David, do you know the difference between love and sex?" I did not. And the question was certainly beyond my years.
Batman and boobies. I love this story. I think you've really captured that path we all go through as we become aware of our own sexuality. It's super odd that no one in your class mentioned anything to you. Do you think you may have blocked a little bit of it out?
You know what? I thought about it a lot, and I can't really be sure, but I'm pretty sure nothing was said. I remember my dad talking to me about it. I remember thinking, why didn't anybody talk to me about it? I just can't imagine the teacher having a talk with the class separate of me, and don't talk to David about it. But I can imagine maybe everybody was embarrassed, and maybe that's why they didn't talk about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think a lot of people can remember those nudie pens. A pen where if you held it one way, there's a lady at one end and she's all dressed. And then if you hold it the other way, she's suddenly naked. And I wanted to play with it more, but my mum was kind of trying to avoid that. At the end of that story, there was a pretty weird chat with your dad. What do you think he had to cover?
I'm sure the parents of the boys I gave the cards to wondered about my living situation, because in the 80s, being a single dad was a unique and uncommon situation. And I'm glad the cards didn't make things any more complicated for my dad, but I'm sure it was definitely not a pleasant conversation. But the way he handled it, I felt was really nice.
Felt like he had your back there. So like he spoke to you about it without a reprimand. And I think that's so important in parenting, is that your child's curious and acts out of, I don't know, seeing something done similar somewhere else. It's not that they are intrinsically trying to cause trouble. So I think it's a really beautiful story, actually, of being a dad.
When my mom was here and we told her the story, she mentioned how she remembers my dad calling her, because they were separated at the time, still are separated, of course. And they were trying to figure out where I got that information from. And they never would have suspected it was my uncle's bedroom, a calendar.
Mystery solved. I wonder what mysteries we'll be left hanging with as our kids get older.
I can't imagine what pornography is going to be like in the future. Like that Black Mirror episode when two guys are playing a game, and then one is a girl in the game, and it explores gender roles, sexuality, and love.
And VR.
Like a calendar seems like just scratching the surface. I mean, we can imagine it, but I don't think we can imagine how we'll be able to respond.
Did you see it as an educational experience?
I think it was more confusing than educational, but I do think there was an educational element to it. I don't think I'd want our daughter to learn about sex the way I did. I feel like it should be a little bit more out in the open, because I definitely felt like I was, keeping something a secret.
Similar on my side, I feel like I just didn't have a lot of information to feel confident in taking my journey to investigate my sexuality until I was much older. But I definitely wouldn't mind helping our daughter with as much information as she wants, but all the privacy that she needs.
That actually brings us nicely to the interview.
Let's cue it up.
Today, we're thrilled to have a guest with an eclectic background in relationships, intimacy, and activism. I first encountered her as the co-story writer on the musical Home Street Home, a story with some sharp edges but cleverly wrapped in a warm leather blanket. Notably, it casts a spotlight on some habits and lifestyles I was personally reigniting after moving to Amsterdam. Through that hazy journey, I discovered a mindful and creative writer that also happens to be a pro in lifestyle dominatrix, fetish model, adult film producer, activist, and artist. She's a mom, and she's a dom, but to the world she's known as Soma Snake Oil. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us today.
I gotta say, I love that it's a warm leather blanket. That's very specific.
I wondered if you'd noticed because it's got so much heart in it, but I really wanted to at least subtly imply that it's an edgy blanket.
Yeah, a little bit kinky.
Yeah, just a touch.
If I may borrow some of the ideas from Home Straight Home, you mentioned the lack of intimacy in our lives as part of what's damaging our culture.
It's interesting that we are in this time, I think, of COVID, which is a time of social isolation, because so much study had gone into the epidemic of loneliness before this. So I think we're in this pandemic that has really added to something that was already there, this loneliness. And I mean, we could talk about all of the different contributing factors of modernity that have led to loneliness, whether it's technology or capitalism, sort of like end stage capitalism, whatever it is, people are lonely.
I'm curious about your work as a dominatrix, because I imagine your clients weren't so much lonely in the typical sense. What I mean is, was it more about repression, whether it be gender, sexual, political, or racial oppression? And maybe their time with you was about taking control of that, fighting the loneliness or whatever boxes they feel they were confined to.
Yeah, I mean, I do believe BDSM is therapeutic, especially if you've taken the time to really study it and learn it. I think that's a very big aspect is catharsis. Even if it's just the conversational part of it, before and after a scene, it's a big thing. It's a big part of what we do is deep sharing and, kind of going backwards to what we talked about before. Intimacy is just part of BDSM. I mean, the history of BDSM is the reimagining and reclaiming of traumatic historical narratives, which would include racism, master-slave relationship. And we fuck with all sorts of things that are historically based in suffering, whether it's 1950s household, like all of it, sissification. I think it's really interesting for men to experience what it is like to be feminized and maybe identify for a period of time.
There are themes of intimacy, sex, power, and healing throughout your work. But in one of your paintings, you express some sadness that the real intimacy you experienced behind the scenes of a porn shoot wasn't something more people were interested in.
Like, whoever's listening to this, I don't know if they've seen it and all of that, but we can describe this painting as a story of this scene that I did, and it's very explicit in the description. And then it also goes into some of the more intimate experience that I had with this man, and how after going through this whole scene, I then went and I took the money from this scene that I did, and I paid for my kids' school. And going into this experience, I would imagine talking about this a little bit later, but as a younger person doing adult film, I got into adult film not because I wanted to be a porn star, but because I wanted to pay my bills. And I was a single mom, and education was like this top priority, because I wanted my kids to have a better life. And I was doing that by hustling my ass. And I think this is a story very much of, this is very much an American narrative of, sort of getting through society in a capitalist society. And it's fucking messy. This scene, to me, I see as survival sex. And this story is about survival. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
It does.
We've also started to notice that high school sex ed curriculums have begun talking about pornography. We're curious how you might approach porn education, if you will.
They're discovering porn way younger than we think, probably in grade school. So it's definitely up to parents as well. But schools, from my perspective, something for schools to address, but also if it's going to be addressed, it's how to address it and then to discuss the different kinds of porn. And having done the range, I feel like it's super important to talk about the difference between really toxic porn and then ethical porn. And there is ethical porn around even hiring practices and people having consent for what's going on in the scenes and feeling comfortable. And I think we can have some of those complex conversations with people at a young age. And I think that we should. I actually had an experience working on Hope Street Home where a young woman came up to me and she thanked me for my BDSM work. And she said that she had started watching my work. And she said, I watched all of your scenes with Dungeon Corp. And I started watching this when I was like 13, 14 years old. And I was like, oh, I do not want to hear this. This is like, I'm sort of imagining when I made what I made, I'm just sort of imagining, random men jerking off to my work on the internet. It wasn't crossing my mind that it'd be like young girls. You know what I mean? This is not something that I thought of. And then she's coming up to me and thanking me for my work. And she's talking about how she's in a healthy BDSM relationship now. And it's sort of a young queer person that has found their way with something. Well, this is a young kinky person that found their way. And she said, you really helped me come to terms with a lot of parts of myself. And now I'm in this relationship and I feel really good. And I found my community and all of this stuff. So that was an important thing to hear. But at the same time, I also felt like, did you see something too young? Like as much as parents want to protect their kids, your kids are looking at stuff on Tumblr. I'm sorry to break it to you. It's happening. So yes, we've got to have the big conversations in a way that is open and healthy and non-judgmental, and also talk about some of the stuff that, might be challenging.
We're curious how you handled these tricky topics with your daughters, because as new parents ourselves, we're definitely open to hear how you've navigated this area.
Well, you can learn from my mistakes. How about that? And that might be a little bit of an overstatement to some degree, but I think the internet being what it is has definitely created a lot of different challenges for parents that weren't there before. And with my kids, I really wanted to provide a space that offered them a lot of privacy and freedom, because I experienced the opposite. I had quite a bit of repression and sort of invasion of privacy. So I leaned the other direction. And when they were very young, we had a lot of conversations around don't talk to strangers on the internet. There's like a stranger danger element, because I was very concerned about pedophiles, quite honestly. So there was that when they were younger, and definitely a lot of training around that aspect. But then when they got a little bit older, I definitely gave them their room and their space in their bedroom. And we actually had this conversation recently, and they were saying, I actually encountered porn a lot younger than you think. And they were talking about how it came in the form of sort of like graphic novels and, like anime. And I always just thought they were reading manga, but it was sassy manga. And I was like, oh, okay, it makes sense, right? That you would that there would be some crossover at some point. And that's why my comment earlier about your kids are looking at stuff on Tumblr. My kid was on Tumblr, and I used to say things like, don't look me up on the internet. You're not allowed to look me up. At like age 14, said, I know what you do. So I would imagine around that age, they probably looked me up. And we had a conversation around it. And then like age 17, when they were about to turn 18, they asked me some advice around rope. Can you give me some advice? And I said, yeah, I'll give you. And I gave them a book. And I said, maybe you can actually talk with one of my friends about it and feel more comfortable if you were communicating with someone else rather than me directly about this, but we'll make sure that you're taken care of. So, we had open conversation and then also tried to create boundaries around parent-kid. And
you'd say it was a very open dialogue from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially around things like gender, polyamory, all of those situations as well. I mean, and the fact that I was a BDSM person and all of that. I would say we did not talk about porn as much. That came later, much later.
It was about their sexuality and what they wanted to do.
Yes. Yeah.
I think my parents shied away from having an open dialogue. So I guess like how you've gone the opposite with your kids' privacy, Soma. You want to give them as much as possible because you didn't feel the same way. I kind of feel like I didn't have enough of an education. So I'm like, I'm probably going to overshare way too much. So, but yeah.
I think that it's interesting to come to terms with the fact that your child is a human being who also has sexuality as they grow older. And we put so much shame on sexuality and we get kind of worked up about it. And I think, like we've been conditioned that way, right? So it's really easy to bring that into a situation with our kids and, be worried about things. I mean, it's also out of our control around other people, right? Worry about them getting hurt. Yeah, guys, right? That's part of the thing, right? And we can do our best to prepare our children, but then there's an aspect of it is out of our control. That's challenging.
So finally, we have 3 questions we ask every guest. Looking back to when you were a kid, we'd love to hear about something that inspired the work you're doing today.
I mean, there's so many different things in my childhood, but I like to think that my parents were activists and social revolutionaries in their own way and warriors in a different realm. And I like to think that even though we have very divergent paths and beliefs, that I learned a lot from them about sort of radical living and thinking.
There were missionaries. What do you mean by radical living, though?
Well, they were missionaries, but they smuggled Christian propaganda into East Bloc countries during the Cold War, and they were involved in the underground church in the former Soviet Union, and they were up to all sorts of very radical activity.
And now today, as an adult, what's something you've learned recently?
Something that I was thinking about just recently is I like to think of myself as very strong and very patient and being able to sit through anything and be with whatever's there. And more recently, I came to terms with just because I can sit through anything doesn't necessarily mean I should. So sort of an idea of when's a good time to let situations or people go.
Finally, looking to the future, what is one thing you'd hope to experience in your lifetime?
Decriminalization of sex work in the U.S.
That's interesting. What would you say would come out of decriminalization in the U.S.? Because it's very different than here.
So I think the difference, first of all, is legalization versus decriminalization. And we're interested in decriminalization, whereas you have legalization, which comes with a whole set of different issues. With decriminalization, what we're really looking for is less marginalization. And there's very heavy marginalization in the U.S. and active laws that oppress sex workers and make it easier for predators to rape, kidnap, kill our sex workers in a very active way. And so with decriminalization, we would see less oppression from both the establishment and more safety for sex workers.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. You can catch Soma leading meditations at Against the Stream and helping the homeless community in Los Angeles with the Sidewalk Project, which you can join at thesidewalkproject.com. If you'd like to see more of her art, check out Punk Rock and Paintbrushes at punkrockart.com. And for your not safe for work viewing, see her adult film, Rubber Bordello. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. It was really a pleasure.
So Megan, what did you learn today?
I feel like I got to reflect a lot on my own origin sexuality story. I don't tend to dwell much in the past. I tend to block it out for whatever reason. But I really enjoyed thinking about those things based on the story that you told earlier. I also really enjoyed hearing about the Sidewalk Project. I think it sounds like an amazing charity.
And how about you, listener? I'd love to hear maybe how those things are intersecting in your lives these days. Thanks, everyone.
That's episode 2.
Big Giant Heads is written, produced, and hosted by me, David Fasulo. And Megan Orr is my invaluable co-host, sounding board and mother to our baby, the space baby, and co-conspirator for these episodes. Intro and all the music in this episode was composed by the talented Matt Fasulo. If you're looking for a composer or a music producer of any kind, check out his work at mattfasulo.com. If you enjoyed the show, check us out on Patreon or consider following us on Twitter or Instagram. Search for Big Giant Heads on both platforms or grab the links from the website. Visit biggiantheadspodcast.com for all questions, comments, or inquiries.